Welcome. We've got some really interesting material here, and today we're diving into it to get everyone quickly up to speed on, well, a massive topic, the U.S. and China, and the potential for conflict. We're looking at it through this historical lens, rising versus ruling powers.
Yeah, exactly. The excerpts you shared from Graham Allison's Destined for War really lay out this framework centered on what he calls the Thucydides Trap.
Right, the Thucydides Trap. So our goal here is to pull out the key ideas, the historical parallels Allison draws, so you can really get the gist of the U.S.-China dynamic without, reading hundreds of pages. Consider it your shortcut to getting informed on this.
Okay, let's start with history then. It's always tempting to look back for clear answers, isn't it? But Allison quotes Arnold Toynbee, saying something like, "The only lesson from studying the past is that there are no permanent winners and losers." History gives us context, but not simple blueprints.
And that risk of just getting it wrong. Allison kicks off with that story, the German chancellor before World War I, saying, "Ah, if we only knew." It's chilling, really, how leaders can just stumble into disaster because they misread things.
Absolutely. Which brings us right to the main point, the Thucydides Trap. It's based on the Peloponnesian War, right? Thucydides wrote about Athens and Sparta.
Yeah, Athens was the rising power, Sparta the established one.
And when Athens started getting stronger, challenging Sparta's dominance, that dynamic itself, the fear it created in Sparta, made war basically unavoidable, according to Thucydides.
And Allison points out it wasn't just Athens' raw power. Athens thought its rise was, pretty benign, even good.
Exactly. But it was that very growth and Sparta's reaction, the fear it caused, that Thucydides pinned as the real driver. His famous line, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable."
So that's the trap. And applying it today, well, the U.S. is the established power, China's the one rising fast. The parallels seem pretty clear. Allison asks, are we seeing echoes of 1914 now? You see headlines about China being aggressive all the time.
We do, but Allison's quick to caution against making it too simple. He mentions his colleague, Ernest May, saying the differences matter at least as much as the similarities. It's not a carbon copy.
That's a fair point. What are some key differences then?
Well, one thing Allison brings up, via Lee Kuan Yew, is how intently China has studied the U.S. Lee was apparently quite influential, a sort of mentor figure from Deng Xiaoping right up to Xi Jinping.
So China's rise isn't happening in a vacuum. They've been watching the current superpower.
Very closely. They've learned from America's successes and presumably its mistakes, too.
Okay, let's shift to the economics then, because the scale of change there is just huge. Allison paints this picture. Late 18th century, Britain's industrial revolution is starting, China's comparatively poor, British workers way more productive.
Right. Imagine King George III sending someone over, and the average Chinese worker could barely produce enough to feed themselves. Now, totally different story. Well, U.S. workers are still more productive, sure, but that gap, it's closing. Fast. Allison suggests if China gets to just half U.S. productivity levels, its economy could be double the size of the U.S., if they ever matched it. Maybe 4 times larger.
4 times. Wow, that completely reshapes the global balance, doesn't it?
Fundamentally. He uses this seesaw analogy, U.S. on one side, China on the other. While America has been, let's say, distracted or debating things, China's just been growing consistently, maybe 3 times faster than the U.S. for years.
And it's not just potential future growth, is it? Allison lists areas where China's already #1.
Oh, yeah, loads of areas. Biggest producer of ships, steel, furniture, electronics, phones, computers. Biggest consumer, too, for most things. Cars, for example. They make more and they buy way more than the U.S. now.
So manufacturing powerhouse and giant market, all rolled into one.
Pretty much. And that leads to this idea of purchasing power parity, PPP. Experts like Stanley Fischer say it's maybe the best way to compare economies, especially for military potential.
Right, because a dollar buys different amounts in different places. PPP tries to level that out.
Exactly. And by that PPP measure, Allison says China's economy already overtook the U.S. a few years back.
Already bigger in real terms. That's significant.
It is. And think about this. Since the 2008 financial crisis, something like 40% of all global growth came from China alone.
40%. From one country.
Staggering, isn't it? He gives that visual. China in 1980, poor, rural, bicycles everywhere versus today. The speed, the scale, it's almost hard to grasp.
And all that economic power is now being plowed into
what?
The future. High-tech.
Definitely. High-tech manufacturing, especially. Allison shows how China's share of the global value in that sector has shot up, while the U.S. share has actually dropped.
Like what specifically?
Robotics is a big one. They file way more patents, install far more industrial robots each year than anyone else. They lead in making computers, semiconductors, comms, tech, even pharmaceuticals now.
Is it still mostly copying, or is there real innovation? That's always the question.
Well, Allison acknowledges the IP theft issue, definitely. But he also stresses there's genuine homegrown innovation happening now. They've passed the U.S. in total patent applications. They're set to lead in R&D spending soon.
Any examples of that innovation?
Yeah, supercomputing is one. They have more of the world's fastest machines, and their top one runs on chips designed and made in China. Plus, big strides in quantum communication, building the world's biggest radio telescope. He contrasts this with some recent struggles the U.S. has had with mega projects, suggests a real shift in capability.
Okay, so economic power, tech power.
Yeah.
That naturally leads to wanting more, say, globally, right? Like the AIIB.
The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, yeah. Allison frames that as China basically saying, okay, if you won't give us a bigger voice in the World Bank and IMF, we'll start our own.
And lots of countries joined, even U.S. allies.
They did. Britain, Germany, Australia, despite U.S. objections. That was a pretty clear signal.
And then there's the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
Oh, bore. That sounds enormous.
It is. One belt, one road. It's this massive, multi-trillion-dollar plan to build infrastructure, ports, railways, pipelines connecting China across Asia, Europe, Africa.
Trillions. How big is that, really?
Allison quotes someone estimating it's like funding 12 Marshall Plans simultaneously. It's not just about roads and rail. It's about creating new trade routes, deepening diplomatic ties, shifting the whole center of gravity, potentially.
So behind all this,
Yeah.
what's the driving force? What's the leadership thinking? Allison talks about Xi Jinping's ambition, right?
Yeah.
Make China great again.
Yeah, that phrase really captures it. And again, Lee Kuan Yew's insights are key here. He saw this deep desire in China's leaders and its people to restore China to what they see as its rightful place in the world after the century of humiliation.
It's not just about being rich, then.
No, it's about being rich, powerful, respected, and proud. And for Xi, the Communist Party is absolutely central to achieving that. Allison mentions Xi's fixation on the Soviet Union's collapse.
What about it?
He sees it as a total nightmare scenario. He thinks Gorbachev messed up by loosening political control before fixing the economy, letting corruption run wild, letting the military drift away from party control. Xi seems determined not to repeat those mistakes.
So maintain tight political grip, crack down on corruption, keep the military loyal to the party.
That seems to be the playbook. It ensures stability and control as they pursue this national rejuvenation project.
Okay, so huge economic rise, global ambitions, strong leadership. How does the military fit in? Because that's where the conflict risk really comes into focus.
Right. Allison points to a RAND study suggesting China's military is rapidly catching up or even getting ahead in specific areas crucial for, say, a conflict over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. The U.S. zone of dominance is shrinking, they say.
And China's shown it can be tough militarily in the past, haven't they?
Definitely. Allison reminds us of the Korean War. China jumped in even facing potential U.S. nuclear use under MacArthur. And the border clashes with the Soviets in the 60s, which got serious enough that Moscow apparently considered a preemptive nuclear strike.
Wow. And the U.S. actually warned Moscow off.
Apparently so, according to some accounts Allison cites. But the point is, China hasn't historically shied away from conflict when it felt its core interests were threatened.
And how do they see the U.S. military presence now in places like the South China Sea?
Allison suggests they see it as basically an outdated relic of World War II, an unwelcome presence in their backyard. That perception contributes to incidents like the USS Cowpens near miss, or that spy plane collision near Hainan Island years ago.
And in the South China Sea itself, they're building islands, militarizing them, creating facts on the ground.
Exactly. Dredging sand, building runways, deploying missiles, changing the physical and strategic reality regardless of international rulings.
Allison walks through some scary scenarios there, right? How things could escalate.
Yeah, very sobering. Starts with maybe a Chinese Coast Guard ship bumping or sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat, then maybe a U.S. ship gets involved. An accidental collision, a sinking. Suddenly you're in a shooting war, maybe cyber attacks, space assets targeted. Miscalculation is a huge danger.
It sounds like a slippery slope. He contrasts this with Germany's reunification, which was peaceful.
He does, but notes the context was totally different. NATO was there, partly, as the old saying went, to keep Germany down, Russia out, and America in. Not really comparable.
So given all this risk, how do you avoid the trap? Allison looks at cases where war didn't happen between rising and ruling powers, like Britain and the U.S.
Right. That's maybe the most hopeful analogy, what worked there. Allison points to a few things.
Like what?
Shrewd leaders on both sides who were realistic, made a virtue of necessity, didn't demand everything. They figured out what their absolute vital interests were versus just wants.
And they realized war would be just devastatingly costly.
Exactly. The cost was seen as prohibitive. Plus, they had deep cultural ties, shared values, which helped smooth things over. Easier communication, maybe more trust.
He also mentions the Cold War. Obviously very different, but lessons there too.
Yeah, the need for a coherent grand strategy. Really understanding the other side, what motivates them, what their red lines are, and focusing relentlessly on your own core interests. And of course, nuclear weapons MD, mutually assured destruction, made direct war unthinkable.
And now Allison talks about MAD, mutual assured economic destruction.
Exactly. Because the U.S. and Chinese economies are so intertwined now, a major conflict would cripple both. That interdependence could be a powerful deterrent, maybe.
But he also warns about alliances, like before World War I.
Yeah, the fatal attraction of alliances, how treaty obligations dragged countries into that war who might otherwise have stayed out. A warning against getting locked into automatic escalations.
Instead of just reacting or pushing back harder immediately, he suggests
a serious pause for reflection. He thinks current strategies might be based on illusions, a bit like leaders held in 1914. He argues this isn't a problem you solve quickly, it's a chronic condition you have to manage carefully over the long haul.
Okay, so what are the principles for managing it? Diagnosis before prescription, he says.
Right. First, really understand the deep structural forces at play, the historical context. Don't just jump to solutions.
And question some assumptions. Like, does the U.S. have to have total military dominance everywhere? Does the U.S. have to write all the rules?
Those are the kinds of hard questions he thinks need asking. He even suggests maybe a council of historical advisors to study past cases, but warns again, no easy analogies.
What about the current U.S. approach? Engage but hedge.
He's pretty critical of that. Says it basically allows everything and forbids nothing. Too vague, lacks clear lines.
He talks about negotiated accommodation, too, like Yalta. That's controversial.
Very. But he throws out these tough, maybe uncomfortable questions. Could there be deals? Spheres of influence? Would the U.S. ever trade concessions on, say, Taiwan for guarantees elsewhere? It's about exploring all options, even difficult ones.
And the whole values clash.
Yeah.
Democracy versus China's performance legitimacy.
That's a huge factor. How much weight do you give to internal systems versus external behavior? He also brings up strategic patience, like Deng Xiaoping, setting aside the Senkaku-Diaoyu Island dispute with Japan for a later generation to solve. Don't fight over everything all at once.
Are there specific areas where maybe they could cooperate or de-escalate?
He suggests possibilities.
Yeah.
Maybe agree to freeze disputes, like in the South China Sea, reaffirm freedom of navigation, set limits on cyber attacks, agree not to interfere in internal politics, find win-win economic opportunities, work together on global issues.
And managing the nuclear risk seems absolutely paramount. He draws on the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, Kennedy's handling of it. Giving Khrushchev space, avoiding ultimatums, finding off-ramps. Understanding the other side's perspective and pressures is crucial to avoid backing them into a corner, especially when nukes are involved.
It comes back to really understanding their core interests, from their point of view. Sun Tzu stuff.
Know your enemy, know yourself. Exactly. And finally, he stresses that both countries need to get their own houses in order. Domestic strength and stability are fundamental to navigating this kind of long-term challenge.
Well, it's clear there are no easy answers here. Navigating this U.S.-China relationship is incredibly complex, deeply rooted in history, but also constantly evolving. We hope this deep dive has helped clarify some of the key dynamics and thinking around it.
And that final thought from Allison, quoting Shakespeare, "Our destiny lies not in our stars, but in ourselves." It really puts the onus on the choices that leaders and maybe all of us make going forward.
Absolutely. If you want to dig deeper, Graham Allison's Destined for War is the place to start. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.